Hi, I'm Sandy Anderson, and I'm here to kind of give you an overview of tort liability and some different court cases that have kind of been a little bit monumental in setting the parameters of tort liability and just different ways that court cases have gone. Tort liability is when individuals are responsible and liable for their behavior or possibly their lack of behavior that results in injury or damages to another person. The actual definition of tort liability goes to many different extents. There's intentional tort liability, where the person creating the harm or damages to another person, it was deemed intentful. A lot of the time, this includes battery, which is actual physical harm to another person, or assault, which is somebody making the other person believe that they are going to harm them. There's also different types of intentional liability or tort liability, such as false imprisonment, where somebody is held with the belief that they cannot escape or escaping is not an option. There's also intentional infliction of emotional distress, and this has to be something where a person has such emotional distress that is above and beyond the typical means of, say, daily anxieties. There's also unintentional types of liability tort, such as negligence. This kind of becomes a little bit more not black and white in courts, and a lot of decisions are left up to juries and judges to decide. A lot of this falls onto the definitions of duty, specifically with teachers, what is mandated as a teacher's duty to do. Courts usually decide what is reasonable and what is not. There's also negligence per se, which basically says that if a person's negligence or their actions were in violation of the law, then it can be deemed negligent in that type of tort liability case. There is also malpractice, where a person who is established to have additional knowledge, their expectations are higher than, say, your average person. Specifically, like with a doctor, if you expect them to be able to provide adequate care for you and they do not, they can be deemed liable through tort liability because of this. This is usually labeled as malpractice because they're expected to be professionals in that area and they did not compensate. One interesting thing that I learned about that was the person's level of professionalism does not have to be at the ultimate high. They could be the lowest of their class and it wouldn't make a difference as far as their professional experience. It's just if they are deemed, for example, let me back up there, sorry. Say I was a practicing teacher. If I am in my very first year, very first day of teaching, I would be held to the same liability expectation as a teacher who has been there for 35 years and may have much more under their tool belt and experiences. So that was one interesting thing I found with malpractice. There's also different defenses that those who are on the receiving end of a tort liability case can have. One of those would be assumption of risk, which means when somebody does a knowingly dangerous activity, we assume that they know the risk. That does not always have to be verbalized. It can just be implied by the person partaking in that activity. And it doesn't have to cover gross negligence either. There's also immunities where if you are protecting the greater good, say like in a public scenario where somebody might be at danger and somebody steps up to help protect, they can be considered immune because of that, such as possibly police officers or firefighters. They can be immune from any liabilities in those cases. So kind of diving into some of the court cases, which I love reading about court cases, and then a lot of them really make me sad because I've let's just dive into the court cases for now. The first one was Frame versus Comax that I read about, and that's where assault and battery charges were filed. There was a substitute teacher who was in the classroom administering a spelling test, and there were disruptive students that were asked to leave the room. Many complied, and then when the substitute teacher continued the test, there was a student who continued to be disruptive. So being asked to leave, the substitute teacher walked over to the student and went to put his arm on him, which I can only visualize. I was not present, and so it's hard for me to speculate as far as what placing a hand on somebody would mean. And the student fell and then was I don't know if the student actually was injured, but their parents filed charges for assault and battery against that teacher. When you evaluate what the courts found, they found that the teacher's actions were justified and necessary for the learning process, which, when you think about it personally, like, can go either way. Like, you're kind of validated as a teacher, like, okay, but then we also have enough research and evidence and policies in place to know that we should not ever put our hands on students. When I think about ways to be proactive, learning that this was a substitute teacher, I think, calls for a lot of proactive measures to be put into place to design systems of supports and policies for when removing students from the classroom. When I think about the professional side of it, I definitely think there's a high need for improved training for substitute teachers. And it's so hard because there's such a need for substitute teachers because of the increased demands of teachers to be out of the classroom, such as for professional learning, that the 60 hours that they are required to have that makes them okay to, or legally okay to obtain a substitute license. But like for our school specifically, we could have somebody who comes in and is a substitute teacher and has never been in our building, would never have any idea about any laws or legalities, and they could be subject to this type of lawsuit. Like, we need to do better in training our substitute teachers to be more informed about what is okay and what is not. As far as reactive measures, if this was to happen in my district, I would say that substitute would probably be placed on probation and complete the necessary training for knowing what is okay and what is not. For the second lawsuit, it was Flanagan versus Canton. And in this instance, the teacher was sued for negligence. Their class was being disruptive during PE, and so the teacher sat them down and kind of gave them a little lecture for a few minutes prior to going in, and then release the students to go into the locker room to change. Now, typically, the teacher would be monitoring and supervising this, but because there were disruptive students, a few of them were set aside, and the teacher talked to them individually as the others went in to change. And during that time, one of the students in the locker room was harmed and fell down and hit their head and then was injured. And so the lawsuit came from the negligent teacher not supervising the students. This one was a hard one for me because it's hard to find the balance of how do I talk to these students individually and provide the supports that I need for each of them. In fact, I could probably quote multiple times of having administration say, oh, pull that student to the side and have an individual conversation. Well, in doing so, you have to also ensure that you're adequately supervising the other 20 students in the room. The court case actually kind of went back and forth because then at the end, the court said that it was a foreseeable event because the class was acting disruptive. That actually should have told the teacher to ensure that that teacher is supervising everyone since it was kind of a disruptive day. So they were actually found guilty of that. As far as proactive, I think funding support staff to monitor specific areas of the school that require a teacher to be in two places at once, such as when you have students who need to be talked to on the side, like we need support staff that are going to be there that will ensure the monitoring and supervision of other students to ensure their safety while we are doing what is also deemed necessary by our job. When I think of reactive, I definitely think this teacher would be placed on probation. Unfortunately, based on the magnitude of the court case, they could also be dismissed. It would probably just depend on how much publicity the court case received. Professional-wise, I think providing adequate training on tort liability to all staff is definitely a necessary measure. Another court case is Mitchell versus Cedar Rapids Community School District. This one was it was interesting to me. What happened was a special education student skipped out of their last period of the school day. Prior to skipping that class period, they had called home to receive permission to go to a friend's house afterwards instead of following the daily routine, and received permission from the parents. So what happened was they then skipped the last period of class and went with an older student who was an older special education student who was about 19 years old, and they went and engaged in sexual activity. And then the parent then was able to pick the student up from there. Well, this specific student didn't say anything that they were raped or anything like that until months down the road, and then the mother filed a lawsuit against the school because the school did not contact her immediately when the child was marked absent, and the mother said that because their child was identified, that there should have been additional measures taken. So I don't know. One thing I think is to be proactive, maybe at that high school level, an automated policy calling home within 20 minutes that student is marked absent. Just thinking down the road, if that was to actually happen at our high school, and I think about, like, say, kids who participate in sports, those parents would be receiving phone calls almost daily when their students aren't in class. Another thought that I had would be to have additional supervision for education students, and that was also suggested by the mother who filed the lawsuit. So when students are absent, additional measures can be taken. Reactive, what my district might do is ensure a policy is in place to prevent future incidents. And then professional would be to provide adequate training for staff to staff responsible for attendance and absence handling, such as, like, if a secretary is the one who gathers all that information, provide additional training and education as far as what they would need to do. There is also Pierce versus Hearn Independent School District. Kind of felt this one is a little bit black and white. An ag teacher took students to his personal farm to learn about ag, which great hands-on experience. However, one of the students was killed on an ATV. There was no parental consent given for this, which there's just a lot of red flags that I believe occur in here, and kind of using that common sense, like, these are probably not things that we should do, as far as, like, safety measures that should be taken if that was to be in place. Proactive would definitely be to receive permission from parents anytime that students leave a campus, inform them of what activities they would be doing. A reactive measure on our district would definitely be to ensure safety precautions through training, and I would probably say the dismissal of that teacher. And then professional things would be educate staff on tort liability. This class has been phenomenal for learning what teachers can be held liable for, and we need to share that information with all staff who could potentially be liable for instances like this. The last one I chose was Barrett versus USD 259, and I chose this one because it happened here in Kansas. You know, it's not too far from home. I think often we think a lot of these lawsuits occur other places. It would never be us, but I felt this really made me open my eyes to know, like, we're all subject to tort liability every single day and every single decision that we make in the classroom. And what happened here was there was a football practice that apparently lasted all day, began at 8 in the morning, and then this occurred. And what happened was the child collapsed on the field and was taken away by ambulance and then died the next day. When reading through the terms of the case and the conditions, there was talk about equality, and I think it's a catch-22 because what it was saying was that each student needs different things. So if that student was, like needing to set out, that they could. But I also feel that in that same scenario, a coach could easily be liable if they were to allow one or two players to not have to participate in conditioning and then other ones. And I think they could be subject to lawsuit on that. So at the end of the day, I think we all have so many decisions to make, and we have to really think about what we're doing very quickly, just putting policies into place, and know what we can do and what we cannot do. Thanks for listening.